Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today to celebrate the launch of Liam Stanley's new book, Britain Alone, How a Decade of Conflict Remade the Nation. Today's event will take the form of a panel discussion, and Liam will be joined by Dr. Maya Goodfellow and Professor Matt Watson. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Hannah Lambie-Mumford and I am the co-director at the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, or SPERI, and it is my absolute privilege to introduce this event today. Britain Alone, published by Manchester University Press, is a new history of British politics and society since the financial crash. So I'm going to start with introductions to our panellists today. So Liam Stanley is lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield and is a fellow at the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. Britain Alone is his first book. Maya Goodfellow is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at SPERI, and Maya's research looks at the forms of racism that are produced by the politics of the centre, thinking in particular about the relationship between capitalism, racism and immigration. She is the author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, published by Verso in 2019. Matt Watson is Professor of Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. He was recently a UK Economic and Social Research Council Professorial Fellow, engaged on the project Rethinking the Market. He's the author of 4 books, including most recently The Market, published in 2018. By way of an overview of this afternoon's session, we will begin with Liam, who will introduce the book. Then we will hear from our 2 discussants, Maya and Matt, who will provide some reflections. Liam will provide some reflections on the reflections, and then we will go to a Q&A, and we will close at 6 o'clock. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Liam.
Thank you, Hannah, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for this event. I'm going to do my best to give a 10-ish minute overview of the book's argument, which is inevitably going to be a bit broad. But before I do so, I'd like to start with a brief but very important acknowledgement, which is just a quick note to say that I'm currently on parental leave, looking after my 7-month-old son. So I'm really obliged to say I'm so grateful to my partner, who is currently working full-time, for giving me some time and space away from my caring responsibilities to be here now, but also to do some preparation for today. So I'm very grateful to them. So my book, Britain Alone, as Hannah said, is a history of Britain since the global financial crisis. And it starts with the following observation, which I've built on from recent post-colonial scholarship. And this observation, as you can see, goes something like this. With the confirmation of Britain's exit from the European Union in January 2020, the UK now has a new relationship with the global economy. So shorn of empire, and now the EU too, Britain's economic authority is as national as it has ever been. So when we think that just a decade or so ago, globalization seemed inevitable, this is a remarkable reversal. So the book asks, why did this happen? And the book shows that the answer to this question can be found in the 2008 global financial crisis and its fallout. The consequent austerity and scarcity have profoundly affected Britain, setting in motion many political conflicts. As a result, history has taken us a different path, and we now find ourselves in Britain with the status and meaning of the country in crisis. So the book traces this process, and what I'll do is, in my 10 minutes, I'll expand a little bit on how it does that. To summarize, I guess, what the book does is it shows how the post-crash years intensified and created new conflicts over who gets what, when, and how, which is another way of talking about distributional conflict. And these conflicts became so intense that politics itself transformed. So rather than just routine engagement over the distribution of resources, political conflict in this era opened up to some of the most foundational questions we can ask in politics, such as what sort of country should Britain be? Where should its boundaries be drawn? And who should be able to access its wealth and resources? Now, as it went, the boundaries of Britain in this period since the financial crisis have been drawn further inward to more closely align with the nation. Now, the book names this process somewhat mischievously as nationalisation. And I say mischievously because, of course, nationalisation is typically thought of as the transfer of services or commerce from private to state ownership. But there's an equally important second definition that this book focuses on, which is to make the state more national. Now, of course, the book goes into some detail about what this means. But to give a couple of examples, in abstract terms, nationalisation might involve excluding non-nationals from state resources, or it might involve creating a new nation-state entity to pursue a different kind of politics. It might mean restricting welfare state access. It might mean building a national health service, or it might mean campaigning for national independence, as well as actions that look to legitimize or justify those moves, such as nation building or a kind of us versus them rhetoric. So the book shows that to understand this recent past as well as the present and future, we must analyze the historical paths that brought us here. So that means being attuned to the relationship between the British nation and the British state, which is obviously quite a strange history. And I say that because, of course, Britain, when it was founded, was neither a state nor a nation. It wasn't a nation because the idea of Britain was brought into existence after the union between two existing nations. The idea of Britain came after the creation of the state. This is why, by the way, historian Linda Colley refers to Britain as a state nation rather than a nation state. But even so, it wasn't a traditional state either, because Britain was an empire. The boundaries of Britain have always extended beyond these isles from its very inception. So Britain, we could think of Britain historically being less so a nation state and more perhaps an empire state nation, if you will. And so it was only after the Second World War that Britain started looking more like a textbook nation state. And this post-imperial nationalisation was central to the modern myth of Britishness. So a key kind of myth here is how the Attlee government founded the post-war welfare state to reward the British peoples for their wartime sacrifices, with, of course, the empire conspicuous by its absence, both in that rollout of welfare and also in the national imagination. So institutions like the National Health Service were for the nation and not the empire, and were appropriately labelled as such. And here, as an aside, this is where, don't need to get into too much detail, but this is where the book shows that those two meanings of nationalisation, so state ownership, but also making the state more national, aren't actually as distinct as it may seem. The NHS is a classic example of both those definitions together. But the point is that it shows how this post-imperial nationalisation is possibly the major source of national nostalgia rather than the empire itself. But this history also only makes sense when empire is put front and centre. So that historical context is very important for understanding where Britain found itself today and the path it took after the crisis. Because what the book focuses on is on a second nationalising era, not the post-imperial nationalising era, but the post-crash nationalising era. And here my argument is that the politics of the global financial crisis created the conditions, austerity, scarcity, inequality for this. And the book goes through a whole series of different ways in which this happened. So leaving the EU was by far the most transformative aspect of this recent nationalising turn. But it's important to acknowledge that it's only one element. And so I'm just going to outline some brief examples that the book goes a lot more detail into to give a sense of what the book covers. So the thrust to realign the British state with the British nation is also apparent in the coalition government's claim that we are all in this together in resolving the national debt emergency in the context of welfare scroungers. The hostile environment and restriction of NHS services to foreigners. It is also apparent in the prevalence of pro-military campaigns and the constant invoking of World War II collective memory. It's also there in the post-Brexit vision of the Johnson government, including levelling up the country to support the left behind. And it's also apparent in the ongoing culture wars, as well as in the lockdown weekly clap for NHS workers. So all of these are major themes and issues that are covered in the book. And the basic argument is that the financial crisis helps create the conditions for all this politics, all this political conflict to happen. And the basic principle is something like this, which is that hard times produce a social impulse towards consolidation. And in this case, to draw in nation-state boundaries, to protect those who are conferred greater value by virtue of being seen as core to the nation. A characteristic that intersects especially, but not exclusively, with race and citizenship. But this process is never and will never be automatic or organic. A number of steps are needed to create and solidify those dividing lines, to mobilize people into participating in contesting those boundaries, and then ultimately to have the power to formally redraw them, which is what happened with Brexit. Some of these players in these conflicts will win, others will lose. But the point that the book makes is that control and patronage of the state is the most decisive weapon. And what's up on the slides right now is the process in which the book traces. So the book also shows how Brexit is only one of 3 nationalising electoral projects that had the potential to remake the British nation in the post-crash years, which are outlined here. So the book focuses mostly on English nationalism because that's the project that won, as it were. But it's important to acknowledge that this is one of 3 potential paths that were open in Britain, as the other 2 being Scottish nationalism, which of course had its chance with the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence, while a form of economic nationalism was revived through the Corbyn-led Labour Party, who of course had that surprise surge in the 2017 general election. And I guess the important point is that all 3 look to realign Britain's nation-state boundaries and so transform Britain's integration into the global economy. Of course, only one of these projects did win, but the story is far from over. Either way, one result of all this is an enlarged political space for projects that look to prioritise and reinvigorate the nation and carve out a new globalisation. So the Johnson government, which in my analysis is neither free market nor is it strong state, is best understood in this context as a nationalising or nationalist project. But of course, it's going to struggle under its own contradictions, which was exacerbated by COVID. So through developing this analysis, what the book ultimately does is it weaves a thread from the fallout of the crisis and austerity through to Brexit into the shape of lockdown politics. And I think that given these nationalising thrusts were given life by the inequalities of the post-crash years, these dynamics have not and will not be going away. And so to wrap up, what I hope the book contributes is the story of how Britain got here and where Britain might be going. A political world that is characterised to some extent by division and decay, where the very future of the nation and state together are in doubt. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Liam, for that brilliant overview and introduction to the book. We will move on now and I will invite Maya to offer her reflections, please.
I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't talk too much because I feel like there's quite a lot that could be said. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about Liam's book, and I'm just firstly want to say that I'm very pleased to see it out in the world. Congratulations, Liam. It's a really great achievement. And when I was reading it over Christmas and when I was going through my notes about it earlier this week, I think that one of the main things that struck me was actually that this discussion around nationalism and nationalisation that you've just heard Liam give you a bit of an overview of was something that I'd been waiting to read. And I think this is going to be the case with quite a lot of people who are interested in questions about nations and nationalism. And in particular, what I mean by that is a work that engages with these ideas in relation to post-crash Britain, and that really carefully thinks through some of the new conflicts we've seen, as well as those that have been intensified. But for me, one that importantly doesn't simply collapse everything into Britain leaving the EU, which I understand the temptation to do that, given what a sort of seismic decision that was, but I appreciate that this is situated in a much broader historical context. And I think the book covers this terrain really, really well. And one of the key things that Liam has talked about, this distinction between nationalisation in terms of state ownership and this act of making the state more national, I think is incredibly useful for a number of different reasons, as is the way that he doesn't collapse ideas around national identity or nationhood entirely into this nationalisation, which is maybe something that we can pick apart a bit further in the Q&A. But one of the reasons that I think this is useful is because it quite purposefully upends the way a lot of people conceptualise nationalisation. And so I think, as well as shedding light on the post-crash years of British politics, which is obviously one of the core aims of the book, for me, when I was reading it and when I was reading through my notes, it also very helpfully speaks to what I would argue are debates that people on the left might avoid thinking about or engaging with. So specifically this argument that if you want to be in control of the British state, you have to some extent be nationalist. And how you think about this, how you understand the idea of a national people, seems to me from reading the book to be crucial to consider if, say, you want to be in government. And so these are not just simply abstract concerns, they have very, very real world implications and applications that should be taken very seriously. And I really appreciate one of the things that the book does is it treats these questions as not simply secondary to questions around economic redistribution, but central to them. And so there's a lot I could sort of say about the strengths of the book, but there's sort of three things that I wanted to mention that I found really, really useful. So the first is that it's really, really, I sort of feel like I can't overstate this enough. It's really refreshing and also actually a really important intervention to see very serious discussion around race, immigration, gender, sexuality, and empire in a text like this, weaving these things together in a really, really nice way. And all too often, these are just sort of dismissed as side concerns. And I think Liam's recognition that an analysis of nationalisation, particularly in Britain, requires a substantial engagement with who is seen to belong and who isn't, how this is articulated and how it plays out is really important. And by taking these lines of inquiry seriously, situating them historically, but also engaging with a range of scholars like Belinda Bamber and Robbie Shilliam, the book provides a really, really necessarily complex analysis of the post-crash fallout in Britain, but importantly highlights that the narrowing of the frames of who belongs and who doesn't is not inevitable. And so by doing so, it does not buy into the arguments that we find in some political science quarters that say anti-immigration sentiment is some kind of natural backlash. And in doing so, I think it recenters our focus in a really important way. Secondly, and relatedly, what I enjoyed about reading the book is that Liam sort of rejects pitting the cultural against the economic right from the outset. So for instance, just for an example, for those of you who haven't had the chance to read it, he discusses the very well-known and widely popularized idea that the financial crash happened because Labour overspent. And so he makes sense of this as not simply being a macroeconomic argument, but also a moral and political statement about rightfulness. And in doing so, brings together two lines of discussion that are often treated separately. And by seeing the cultural and the economic as interrelated in this way, it obviously helps us to understand the past decade in Britain, I think, in in a much more nuanced way, but is also part of a much longer and rich tradition that moves away from considering macroeconomic analysis, for instance, as serious work and the cultural as lighter and less rigorous. And finally, this is just a text that does not have to be confined to the academy. It really is no small feat to produce a book that is both incredibly, and I think intentionally, accessible, but at the same time is not simplistic in its arguments. And I'm a big advocate for communicating beyond the realms of the university, and I think Liam has done exactly that. But it's really is something very, very difficult to achieve. So I think it can't be overstated just how important it is that it is a text that can be picked up by so many people. And I just want to sort of finish by saying that more broadly as a colleague, I've really appreciated the way that Liam is not afraid to challenge certain lines of thinking, but always does so in a way that is very kind, very constructive. He is rigorous, but also open-minded. And these are not always givens in this line of work. So these are qualities that I also think come through in the book and in his writing. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here today, to be Liam's colleague and to have read the book, to have a chance to have read it ahead of time. So congratulations, Liam, on this very, very important contribution. And if, for those of you who are watching, if you haven't already, you should obviously go out and get yourself a copy and read it, because it really does make, I think, a really important intervention into the debates about austerity Britain.
That's lovely. Thank you, Maya. Matthew, would you like to offer some reflections now, please?
Thanks, Hannah. And thank you in particular to you, Liam, for inviting me to talk about your book this afternoon. Or should I say, to help you celebrate the launch of your book, because as Myra's already said, we really should be celebrating this as a piece of work. It's a significant book. It's a very clever book. But it's written always in an engaging style. I really like the way that you reach out to your reader and you offer your reader plenty of opportunity to come into your text with you and to be taken through the stories that the text delivers. And that's a real skill. You might tell us in the Q&A how you've managed to do that, because I suspect that it's a skill that not many people have. And to find someone who can do that and who looks as though they can do that naturally, it feels incumbent to ask you how you do it, because I'm sure it's something that the rest of us can learn from. Anyway, I was really privileged to have a sneak preview of the contents of your book. In fact, I guess I'm doubly privileged, aren't I? Because I've had that same experience twice over now, albeit separated by a number of years, given that I also examined your PhD thesis, and your PhD thesis lies somewhere there within the book. I've actually, this is going to embarrass you probably a bit more now, but I've been dipping back into your PhD alongside reading your book, because it's obviously very interesting from an outsider's perspective to see how your ideas have changed as they've matured. And what I liked about this comparison was how there was something that's immediately recognizable as your voice that shines through both of these texts. You become an instantly familiar part of the narration of your book. And I think that's the case with all of the most persuasive authors that I've come across during my academic career. This was a book that I think could only have been written by you, and it gains much from the fact that it was written by you. And I say both of those things as unadorned compliments. So I hope I haven't embarrassed you too much, and I hope you will take them as a compliment. It's a great book, and I'm sure that everyone else will find it as important to read as I did. Certainly, Maya seems to have done as well. So we would seem to be very much batting for you and supporting your cause in this regard. If you'll allow me though, Liam, I want to focus my comments on you, the author, as much as on the contents of your book. Book launches can sometimes venerate the book as a thing, can't they? When book launches take place in person, you have one next week, it's, well, quite conventional for you to walk in and wave around your book in front of everyone's face and just show it to them. And the book becomes a thing that's somehow detached from the author. Book launches often forget to talk about the effects that writing the book have left on the person who's written it. So that's what I want to focus on. if that's okay, and hopefully to tease out a little bit more from you. I might start in this vein simply by asking you to say something about what it felt like writing the book. It's a topic that seems to have required you to lay yourself bare within the text. Your authorial voice is clear all of the way through, but it's often shot through with frustration. At times it's tinged with exasperation even at what Britain has become politically. It's a voice that sometimes gets just a little bit edgy, quite prickly, even tetchy on occasions. And I really like that. I liked it at one level because it's not what I associate with you as a person. These are not the sorts of characteristics that you carry about or display on a day-to-day basis. But it seemed perfectly in keeping with your subject matter that there were things here that have got under your skin. So why don't you tell us that through your text? And I think you deliver that very nicely. You keep the academic content always front and center, but it's very clear that there are things going on that's driving that academic content that really have left you dissatisfied. And I think it's really nice to see that, actually. You couldn't be expected to write about these developments in a coolly detached matter-of-fact sense, even if standard academic writing seems to compel that. I'm really pleased that you avoided that particular temptation. I was also struck by how brave you were taking this subject matter on. At the very least, I don't think I can imagine myself at this stage of my career being quite so brave and tackling a subject like this as directly as you did. But when I was reading your book this weekend, I think I became more and more aware of the fact that I've been moving increasingly in my own research to historically oriented studies for a number of years now. And it suddenly struck me that I might be hiding in that form of analysis, that I might be sheltering myself away from the sort of subject matter that would leave some sort of a mark on me. I think there's less emotional labor that's required for me to place myself at the heart of historically oriented analysis than there is at the heart of the analysis of modern political conditions. But you've thrown yourself fully into that style of study. And I was really impressed by that. But I also want to ask, at what cost? Usually we talk about the cost of research, don't we? In terms of time, in terms of money to be able to do it. But at what cost to you personally has it been to study this subject matter day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, until you were in a position to write this book? Has it taken an effect on you? Has it changed you in any way, or the way that you look at the world around you? Now, your book certainly had an effect on me in the same way that lots of things have an effect on me. When you get to my age, it made me feel old. And this wasn't just because I decided to look up when I'd examined your PhD and discovered that it was a whole 8 years ago now. Blimey, doesn't time fly? What made me feel really old was that it served as a reminder of all those worlds I've spoken about in the past, both in my academic life and in my political life, all of those worlds that could have been, but now I know that they weren't. And it does take something out of you as a reader as well to recognize all those roads that could have been taken that have ended up being paths that weren't traveled. And I want to know how optimistic you remain for the future of British politics. You've said that one nationalisation project won, but I wrote it down word for word in your presentation, but the story is far from over. So for a natural-born optimist like me, who's discovered that they've become increasingly pessimistic about absolutely everything, can you give me some reasons, please, to try to restore that sense of optimism, that the world doesn't always have to be like this, that this isn't a one-way street that we seem to be trapped into? I can see that I'm already running out of time. I don't want to get told off by Hannah, so maybe just one last group of questions from me. Like many people who read the book, the opening anecdote had me smiling to myself, and not only for the fact that I remember those holographic meter and greeters from New Street Station as well. For anyone who doesn't yet know how the book starts, Liam begins with a self-deprecating story about how he found himself face-to-face one morning with a holographic employee of National Rail who'd taken the job of an actual employee of National Rail to mouth platitudes at you as you walked up the escalators in New Street Station. And the sense of shock at this unexpected encounter led him to research their sudden appearance on the station concourse. And this does become a really quite compelling access point for you to show us how you're then going to try to navigate your way through modern Britain to understand its political essence. The way I read that anecdote, though, it does more than that. It struck me that that opening encounter becomes a metaphor for the contents of the whole book, or it does when viewed from the perspective of the author, from your perspective, and the way that the book becomes an unfolding of the search for political meaning that takes you on a journey throughout modern Britain and requires you to look at a lot of modern Britain very close up and to try to understand what it is that you're seeing. Liam, you might have to forgive me for this, but I read Britain Alone to have a second narrative underpinning it, what might be called Liam Alone. It felt as though you were telling us how bereft you feel you've become politically. I thought what you were presenting here is an account of your search for a vision of Britain that you could commit to, an understanding of a communal we that would generate consent from you, but ultimately you came away empty-handed. The same sense of frustration that you experienced when you were on your physical journey from Birmingham to Sheffield through New Street Station seems to be reflected throughout the book in the frustration you encountered in studying the narrowing of British politics to a series of, from your perspective, unpalatable choices. Felt as though you were taking us on a second journey, metaphorical this time rather than literal, personal this time rather than public, in search of a national sense of self that you feel comfortable with. Your book shows us many different visions of how a national we has been invoked in recent years. You put them up on the slide in your presentation: austerity, a suspicion of immigrants, Brexit, culture wars, ungrounded national bragging, and all of them seem to have left you somewhat cold. I hope you'll take it as the compliment that it's intended to be, but Britain Alone reminded me of the travelogue books that the TV presenter Stuart Maconie wrote 10 to 15 years ago now. There are some obvious differences, of course. He set out in search of emotional attachments to the idea of England, or parts of England. In any case, he tried to locate the North as a lived entity as well as a physical entity. He did the same with Middle England. You set out in search of political attachments to an idea of England, an English nationalisation that gets scaled up to Britain, and how they might translate into acceptable visions of the future. Both of you seem to have arrived at the end of your search with little to show in terms of an answer to your most fundamental question. However, there's a big difference here. Maconie reports having had lots of fun along the way, meeting people in various settings, generally just chatting to them and having a nice time. It seemed from your text as though you had, can I say, less fun along the way, because everywhere you turned to investigate the impact of the most important characters in your story, it took you further away from your preferred destination. Okay, that's where I'll leave my reflections. I've probably gone over time, and I hope you were okay, Liam, that those reflections on the version of you that I think I can see coming out of the text of Britain Alone. It will be interesting to hear whether I've just been barking up multiple wrong trees or whether you recognise yourself in that characterisation as well. Great, great book, but troubling subject matter that I can't help but feel must have left a mark on you in some way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya and Matthew, for some fantastic reflections that give us a really good sense of the book and provoke Liam to come back and reflect more on the process and also the content. So Liam, can I invite you back to reflect on the reflections, please?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Maya, and thank you, Matt, for a very generous set of reflections. I think I'll try and keep this on the shorter side. So I think maybe I'll say a couple of things, mostly in response to a couple of things that Matt said. So Matt asked kind of a series of questions about what it's like to write the book, and the sort of question about optimism, and maybe I can try and answer them in one go. So I guess it's worth saying that I think there's two kind of major experiences I had that inspired this book, and maybe it would be interesting to say a bit about them. I think the first one is when I was an undergraduate student, which would have been in the height of the global financial crisis. And so the question that's always interested me, thinking back to when I was 18 or 19 when the global financial crisis hit, was in that kind of like naive way that you think of when you're that age, is like, why is there no revolution? Why is there nothing happening? Because that's kind of what I've thought was meant to happen when there's a run on a bank and the financial system collapsed. So the question of why there hasn't been like radical change from the financial crisis was always the question that has interested me the most, and that's pretty much underpinned, I think, all the research and all the writing I've done in the last 15 years or so. The second major inspiration is, again, it's probably something I shouldn't admit publicly, but since Matt has asked to reflect on this, I'll share this anyway, which is around the politics of Brexit. So thinking back to the referendum to leave the European Union, about 2 or 3 weeks before, I found myself at an international conference with other sort of political scientists, and I was the only British person there. So at one point when we were having dinner or something, everyone kind of turned to me, 15 people turned to me and said, what's going to happen? And I said, oh, don't worry, like, Britain's never going to leave the EU, it's never going to happen. And obviously after that, and in the days, the weeks, the months and the years since then, I've always kind of wanted to understand why I felt like that, why my critical faculties kind of deserted me when it came to such a major issue. And so in a way, the anecdote that the book starts with about the holograms, even though it's intended to be a bit understated, that was a kind of eureka moment I had, where I was like, these two things that I can't put together, which is why is it that the financial crisis has not led to this transformative change? Yet it evidently has, because in the fallout, in the years following it, Britain left the EU, which is one of the most major transformative things that's happened in the UK, at least in my lifetime. And in a weird way, in that anecdote about the holograms was what allowed me to piece those two things together in a way that probably won't make much sense if you haven't read the book, but hopefully if you do read the book will make a lot of sense. In terms of kind of like at what cost, and like thinking about optimism, I think I can imagine that some of the passages that Matt is referring to probably relate to the Corbyn project, and I guess can speak analytically, the analysis of the situation, which is that even though the Corbyn project made some incredible strides in terms of making otherwise unthinkable leftist political strategies acceptable into the mainstream, it was also, I think, a massive opportunity missed, because there were indeed the social and political conditions for such a project. And I think there's obviously big structural reasons why the Corbyn project didn't work, but there's also reasons that were internal to that project that held it back as a feasible election winning project. And I think the analysis in the book will hopefully explain some of that. Yeah, Hannah, I'll pass back to you now.
Thank you. So just for those of you watching, if you want to submit a question, please do, and they come through to us for me to read out, so keep them coming, please. We've had a couple of questions in. I will ask them now. So the first question we've had is for Liam. So why do you think Britain went down the English nationalism route following the financial crisis, as opposed to the other two that you put on the slide? Do you want to answer that one, and then I'll ask the next question? Sorry, I should have been clearer on that.
That's okay. No, I'm with you. Yeah, so the question is, why did Britain go down the English nationalism route as opposed to the other two? There's different ways we can answer this question. We could look at some of the big structural, big systemic differences between those three projects. We could also look at some of the more kind of what we might call like contingent reasons about those different projects. And I think to understand why Britain went down the English nationalist route as opposed to the other ones, we have to understand both of those sides. So on the structural reasons, I think one of the key things that marks out the kind of English nationalist Eurosceptic project is that it, in comparison to Scottish nationalism and the Corbyn project, is that evidently it was much more able to kind of like work within the status quo, even though it was a massive transformative project, and even though major swathes of the British elite were opposed to it, it was still a project that could work within the status quo when compared to what we would have seen if Scotland had left Britain, or if Corbyn had become Prime Minister. And those entrenched structural interests clearly make a major difference in terms of the potential for these different projects to succeed. I think on the other hand, we can also look at more kind of contingent factors. We can identify many. So to pick out one, for example, I think the way in which Project Fear played out, initially Project Fear 1 in the Scottish independence referendum, and then Project Fear 2 in the Brexit referendum, again, is important to understanding this. There's reasonably strong evidence, for example, that Project Fear being trying to convince voters to stick with the status quo because of fear about the transformative, the impacts that transformation will have on cost of living and so on. There's evidence that was quite effective in Scotland in the independence referendum. So there's some really good research that has shown that voters in the Scottish referendum kind of used a kind of risk-reward kind of model when trying to decide about whether to vote or not. Whereas when it came to the Brexit vote, it's, as I think we all know, Project Fear was an absolute disaster in terms of supporting, in terms of the Remain campaign, and merely went to undermine the campaign, and only went to further support the Brexit claim, the Brexiteers claim that they're trying to work against a so-called metropolitan elite who are holding the country to hostage. So yeah, it's a big question with lots of answers. But I guess I can point to chapter 5 in the book where I go into detail on that one.
That's great, thank you, Liam. One question that I had, if I may sneak one in, as the chair's privilege, if you don't mind, is more of a sort of, I guess, sort of present and future gazing one around, you talked about different kinds of nationalism, and I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing some reflections on some of the recent changes around devolution that we've seen in practice, particularly thinking about the role that COVID played in making the differences amongst policy in the different nations of the UK much increasingly visible, in some spaces of policy increasingly different, and how you think that some of that might play out as we move forward post-COVID.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. That's a really, really good question. I think one of the kind of cliches that was going around in the politics of COVID was this idea that health ministers were to COVID what central bankers were to the financial crisis, which is to say that these players suddenly found themselves right at the heart of crisis management, with a tremendous amount of power to shape the response and therefore shape the future direction of politics. And of course, one of the things that's distinctive about the way in which health is governed in the UK is that it's mostly devolved through the devolution packages introduced by New Labour. So, you know, we had one of the things that, if we think back to the original lockdown, we had that strange situation where Boris Johnson would go on TV and start talking about the UK and Britain, yet seemingly unaware that his powers in terms of healthcare only extended to England itself, while Scotland and Wales especially were introducing completely different measures. So I think what that shows is that there's going to continue to be kind of unintended consequences from the devolution measures introduced in the 1990s. Like, they were explicitly introduced as a way to shore up the union, as a way of kind of, and I don't think this was especially hidden at the time, it was explicitly almost introduced as a way of saying, like, have a bit of power in the hope that you won't want more power, which in hindsight perhaps doesn't make as much sense as it might have done at the time. So there's lots of, it seemed, if we think back to say like May 2020, it did feel that at the time there was a potential for coronavirus and lockdown to be a major union splitting issue. So there was the time when, you know, when there was English people couldn't travel to Scotland. There was the sense that Scotland, for a short amount of time, which slowly dissipated, that Scotland was having a better coronavirus than England. And all those things, I think, would play into a Scottish nationalist cause. That's kind of not really had the impact that it could have done, given the way it's all ended up panning out. But I think it shows that, you know, there is potential for coronavirus to have long-term impacts in ways that we perhaps cannot foresee yet.
Thank you. And this relates to a question that's just come in actually as well. If you had any further thoughts on this side, was could you say a bit more about the impact of the pandemic on the process of nationalisation that you identify? So if you've got anything else to add on that theme.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think judging the impact of the pandemic on the process of nationalisation is quite complicated, because I think if we wanted to jump to conclusions, we could, you know, get a bit excited and say, well, you know, furlough's scheme, that's an example of nationalisation, because, you know, I know this isn't quite right, but one could stretch it to make the case that a whole series of salaries have in practice been bought into like state ownership. Now we know that's not the case. It's not that simple. But it kind of shows that, again, there's a sort of parallel universe, if you will, where things like furlough scheme could have been packaged up in a very kind of like nationalist or nationalising way. It's not impossible to imagine a government that wanted to do so, you know, calling it, you know, the Great British Job Recovery Scheme or whatever it may be, and using it as a form of nation building. Now, it's interesting that the Conservatives under Boris Johnson weren't interested in going in that direction. Some of the way they've governed might suggest that they're interested in that, especially given that Boris Johnson has appointed himself as so-called Minister of the Union, which I don't think he's yet to do anything on, but he holds the role supposedly. So there's that kind of side of it. There's also another side, which is so Will Davis wrote a very good article in the Guardian, which influenced my thinking on the book, on pandemic nationalism. So things like the clap for carers were clearly underpinned. You know, it's clearly underpinned by some kind of like nationalist thinking, even if that makes us uncomfortable, in terms of, you know, well, literally celebrating like national heroes and the work they've done. Again, could have clearly been taken in a direction. Whether it has or whether it hasn't, again, it's perhaps too early to say. But I think what the book says on the pandemic is that this could have been this major nationalising moment for all these different reasons, and it didn't happen really. And that's kind of that's interesting in and of itself. It shows that, and I think that helps show that the processes that the book analyses, like, they're not just automatic. They don't just like happen. They require political power to help put them into practice. And for whatever reason, that was missing with the coronavirus to some extent.
That's great, thank you. So I'm going to take two more questions together, and then we've got a question for all of you that I'll welcome all your thoughts on. So Liam, just two questions together in the first instance. So what are your thoughts on the rise of misinformation, especially in online spaces? And do you think this has had a significant impact on Britain politically? So one on misinformation and online spaces and its impact. And then another question, there have been similar nationalist movements in other countries around the world since 2008. Do you think the reasons for this are the same as the UK? Okay, over to you.
Great, thanks Hannah, and thanks for the questions. So on the rise of misinformation, I think we always have to be a bit careful when we think of the role of technological change in politics. I think it's very tempting to ascribe, great power, great causal power to things like the rise of misinformation in online spaces. And I think there is a temptation sometimes to clutch onto those things because they do, in some senses, provide easy answers. So there's a line of reasoning that I think is especially common around the Brexit referendum, which is to say that, if Facebook was just better regulated, then there wouldn't have been the misleading information shared so widely. And if that hadn't happened, then significant enough people wouldn't have voted to leave, and the UK would still be in the European Union. I don't want to doubt that that's a part of the story, but I always think we have to be a bit careful and skeptical about putting too much emphasis on that. I'd rather point to the kind of wider historical shifts that have undergone and made those things possible. So rather than asking, how, if we got rid of misinformation, would the Brexit vote have changed? I think we could ask the question, why is it that kind of misinformation that was so widely spread in the Brexit referendum was so meaningful to so many people? That seems like a much more relevant question, I think, which isn't to downplay the role of misinformation, but again, I'm a bit wary about focusing so significantly on it, even though it has evidently had some impact. In terms of the next question on nationalist movements around the world since 2008, do we think the reasons are the same as in the UK? Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's kind of, when I finished writing the book, that's the main question I had in my mind. I guess it's a difficult question to answer quickly, but I guess what I can say is, short answer, I think basically yes, to some extent. I think it's important to, when looking at these kinds of dynamics, it's important to acknowledge that what I'm analysing in the book is a kind of like global phenomenon. Like that is important to acknowledge. It's not a coincidence. I think we run into trouble both politically and intellectually if we kind of just analyse like world politics in terms of seeing a series of separate states following their own kind of like path through a comparative lens. I think the only way to understand it is through a global lens, to see our lives, our political lives, our nation states, and the global economy all interlinked. So it can't, put simply, it cannot be a coincidence that nationalism has risen in all parts of the world since 2008. It can't be a coincidence. And I think the reasons broadly are the same, which is a kind of political economy explanation which the book pulls out, which is that when times are hard, we look to shore up ourselves and those who we identify with, and we do so by ultimately trying to mobilize to take state power or the patronage of the state and our governments in order to protect us. And that kind of protection often comes at a cost to other people, and I think that's a process that has played out throughout the world throughout the global economy since 2008, and is continuing to do so. yeah, it's a brilliant question. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam, and thank you all for your questions. I'm going to end with a final question, which is to all the panelists. I'll go round, Maya, Matthew, and then Liam, when you come to answer yours, if you want to give some final reflections as well before we close, that would be great. So the question is, are you optimistic for the future of Britain? Do you think that we will move past the nationalism that's gripping the country? $1 million question, Maya.
It's probably better to start with me because I will be the pessimist here, I think. I mean, I work on border abolition, so it would be difficult for me to be sort of hopeful about the prospect of any sort of thinking about any nation state. But I guess yes and no, just to sort of like try to be a bit more positive. I think that one of the things reading Liam's book and just reflecting on the past 10 years or so of British politics is there was a missed opportunity to sort of change paths with thinking about the 2019 election, but I think there was also a missed opportunity, like Liam mentioned, in that the Corbyn project, not just for thinking about what was going on internally and not just for thinking about how the 2019 election and that sort of gap between 2017 and 2019 was dealt with. But I think this question about who belongs in the nation is a central one and wasn't significantly or sufficiently addressed, shall we say, by the Corbyn project. If you look at even the discourse around immigration, it sort of there was some kind of positive shift, but it was never directly sort of taken on, and it feels like things have just simply entrenched in terms of thinking about how the nation is understood. And although there are arguments to say that immigration, for instance, is less of a political issue now than it once was, but I think we know from history that these things can, the immigration system as it is has an effect on people's lives, and so we shouldn't ignore that in terms of how salient it is politically. But we also know that these things have a sort of can resurface, and if you don't deal with these sort of narratives and these understandings of the nation, then they can be sort of like they've revived as and when. But I guess for the slightly more positive is that there were a load of people politicized by those years, and I think from the sort of like work that I'm involved in, I do know lots of people who are trying to imagine a sort of more positive future for the nation. I think one of the problems is that a lot of those people aren't necessarily in politics, so the route to change, obviously it doesn't all happen in Westminster, but it's hard to see at times, I think. So I'll try. Yeah, that's my sort of slight optimism on the question.
Thank you. Matthew?
Thanks, Hannah. I think I'm going to say much the same. There's a lot to be pessimistic about at the moment, isn't there? And I think if we weren't captured by a sense of pessimism, we wouldn't be looking at the world as it actually is outside our window. I've certainly found myself much more pessimistic over the time period that Liam was writing about than I have any other stage in my life. But I think we need to retain some degree of optimism. I think there's a generational responsibility in this regard, that there are people who are dependent upon us, people who have not yet been born who are dependent upon us, to continue to think about how life might be different. And of course, when we think as political scholars how life might be different, we always mean better, don't we? And I think we owe it to them to retain at least a degree of optimism that we can still have those thoughts, and those thoughts will translate into something that might be actionable as a political project, and that we can help inspire people to deliver that sort of change for themselves, even if we've been incapable of doing it. So I would always want to be able to think that things might be different, that there are some walls that are clearly closing in upon us, but they haven't yet impeded our ability to imagine. And as long as we can imagine, then the world doesn't have to be like this, and we can find a way out of it, I'm sure.
Thank you. Liam, over to you for some last thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'll just say something very briefly on optimism, which is that I guess one of one of the lessons from the book is that, you know, there are big kind of structural historical trends that drive history, but within that there's a tremendous amount of space to do different things. You know, I mentioned earlier that I saw Brexit as being completely unforeseen. I also saw, like many others, you know, Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party is completely unforeseen. So if those two events were, you know, unforeseen to many, you know, perhaps there's some optimism to take in the kind of like radical uncertainty that might be unfolding in front of us. Otherwise, yeah, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll finish there, Hannah.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all so much. And thank you for joining us today and for your fantastic questions. So I'll just close by thanking Liam for writing such a fantastic book and giving us all the chance to celebrate your achievement today. And thank you to Maya and Matthew, our fantastic panelists, for your insight and sharing your reflections. And thank you again to everyone for joining us.